So it is really wonderful to be back in our sanctuary after about 6 weeks away. This has been a strange series of openings and pauses, and as we hoped, thank God, this was a much shorter interlude when our building was closed and when everybody was davening from home. And now it feels very fitting that this Shabbat, when we're back here in our sanctuary, in our synagogue, is Parashat T'rumah, the iconic parashah of sanctuaries. This is where it all began. This is where in the Torah we are guided through the creation of the very first sanctuary of the Mishkan. And we are treated in the language of the Torah through its incredible detail, its visual detail, its tactile detail, to understand how important sanctuaries are, their beauty, their import, the way in which they should be a labor of communal love. So what does it mean to have a sanctuary so carefully, lovingly built that's empty, as this was for the last 6 weeks, and of course, for many months over the last 2 years? What does it mean to have a sanctuary without its congregation? And what does it mean to be a congregation without a sanctuary? Now, next week is a CBST holiday. It's our anniversary Shabbat, and we'll be telling a lot of stories looking back to our origins. But on this Shabbat T'rumah, I can't help thinking about the huge place that the search for a sanctuary took in the history of this community. For so much of its history, CBST was a shoal without a permanent home, always looking, always searching. It wasn't that many years after the founding of the synagogue that Irving Cooperberg, Zichrono Livracha, suggested that it was time to create what became the Premises Trust Fund, chaired for many, many, many years by Sidney Rosenberg, which was the beginnings of saving for a future possibility of a permanent home. Before that, for years and years, for decades, we were always searching, right? If you think about the trajectory of all of the homes that CBST had, right? Its very beginnings in the children's classroom at the Church of the Holy Apostles Community House, the very first high holidays, which were held at a church in Brooklyn, then a short-term space on Bethune Street, the long-term space that many of us remember on Bethune Street, the Javits Center, of course, for Yom Kippur, which God willing we'll be returning to this year. And think about all of the various places we wandered through and have wandered through for Rosh Hashanah and for Pride, right? There was Metropolitan Pavilion, the Hammerstein Ballroom, Ethical Culture, Anshe Chesed, the Masonic Temple, Town Hall, what else? Yes, St. Bart's. I'm sure some people will put in the chat other things that none of us can remember. I remember also in those scary days right after 9/11 when we couldn't get into Bethune Street because it was in the frozen zone, and when we were displaced from our usual spot in the Javits Center because that's where the New York State Troopers were being headquartered. And what does it mean to be adrift, to be wandering, to be without a home? And how do we try to create, and for CBST for years and years, to create a sanctuary without a sanctuary, which is actually very biblical, right? It was an idea of how to create, even during a state of wandering, a holy place. It was a way of containing what can't be contained, what can't be measured, the presence of God. Also, I think, it was not only for God. I think that we read in this parsha, right? So God says to Moshe, "Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," let them make me a sanctuary that I will dwell among them, that God will dwell among the people. Now, do we need that? Do we need a sanctuary in order to experience God? Isn't God supposed to be everywhere, right? For the longtime CVST members, does it feel different spiritually? Is God more here in this place, right? After all of those years of looking, right? This space was purchased in 2011. Ground was broken a couple of years later. It was dedicated in April 2016 after all of those years, right? Of searching, of raising money, of dreaming, of architectural renderings, of creative differences. So why is it so important to have that sanctuary? Does God dwell here in a different way than God dwells in all of those other places? The commentator Sforno wrote, "I will dwell among them permanently. V'shachanti betocham has a permanence to it, in order to receive their prayers and their sacrificial offerings in a manner similar to the way I displayed my presence at the mountain." So this is now after Revelation. The Israelites have experienced this intense moment of God's presence when they were all gathered at the foot of the mountain. So according to these commentators, they wanted more. They wanted something more immediate, more tactile, maybe not quite as overwhelming as the experience of Revelation on a regular basis, but they wanted a base to really feel God in their midst. Another view, which a number of commentators come to because of the kind of slightly strange way these Torah portions are laid out. This portion is full of details on the Mishkan. Next week we have the golden calf, and then we go back to the Mishkan. So why is this? Some commentators think, well, it was a little bit out of order, actually. Golden calf was first, and then Mishkan and Mishkan. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but what they felt was actually the building of the Mishkan was a fallback. It was after the golden calf, God's presence receded. God was so disappointed and alienated from the Israelites that God receded, and the Israelites didn't feel that God was everywhere. And so this was sort of a medium to try to create a place to bring God's presence back so that the Israelites would feel God in their midst. And it was a way that God was willing to return after that experience, right? So it's interesting for us, after this time of feeling afraid of things we didn't used to feel afraid of feeling not quite sure how to return, what does it mean to have things that bring us back to each other? So that's one view, right? That the sanctuary was a way of bringing God back so that God wouldn't feel as absent. Another view, which is expressed in Midrash Tanchuma, was actually the opposite, that the presence of God was so big, was so tremendous, that it made no sense to build something to try to contain it. How can you contain God in a tent? And in fact, there's this Midrash that says that Moses heard three things from the lips of the Holy One that confused and startled him. When the Holy One said to Moses, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them," Moshe replied, "Master of the universe, the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain you. How exactly do you imagine that we'll do this?" And God responded, "It's not what you think. Create this structure, some boards here, some boards there, and I will compress my Shekhinah. I will compress my presence so that I can be there with you, so that I can be present with you." How do you contain the uncontainable? How do you contain the unmeasurable? Was that about God and God's need to be among the people? Or maybe it was helpful for the people who were so often lost and who so often lost faith in the wilderness. This Mishkan, this sanctuary, was a visible reminder that God was with them, because it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget in the wilderness. So even more meaningful than this sanctuary that was said to contain God or part of God, the Shekhinah, the most accessible aspect of God, it was more meaningful because they built it from their own hands with their own gifts. The Parsha tells us, it begins by saying, Daber bnei Israel v'ikru li T'rumah me'et kol ish asher yedavenu libo. Tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart moves them. So everyone should be moved, should see what they are moved to contribute, but it should be built exactly so, exactly as I show you. And so what kind of gifts did the people bring? Of course, they brought gold and silver and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair, ram skins and dolphin skins and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli and other stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. The instructions are so beautiful, they're so precise. It's like a feast for the senses. But remember, this was not a building. This was certainly not the Beit HaMikdash. This was a tent. The whole thing had gold rings on the four corners so it could be lifted onto poles and carried through the wilderness. It was a sanctuary to go. Now, we can't exactly do that with this building, right? So when our sanctuary is a fixed place and we can't get there, what happens? Does God dwell in an empty sanctuary? Do we feel God's presence at home if we can't get to our sanctuary? Rabbi Meir Leibush ben Yechiel Michal, the Malbim, interprets V'shachanti betocham, I will dwell among them, as I will dwell within them. I will dwell inside the people, not in it, not in the sanctuary. I will dwell within them. Each human being, he teaches, is to build a sanctuary in our own heart for God to dwell in. Each of us should build a tabernacle in the innermost recesses of the heart, and there prepare our altar on which to offer up, as it were, aspects of ourselves, whatever we want to offer to God's service. So what did we do, right, when we couldn't come to this place? A lot of us built our own mini sanctuaries at home, in our apartments, at the beach house, up in the mountains. We brought to it what was most precious to us: tablecloths and candlesticks, kippot and sidurim. We learned to bake challah. We learned to crochet kippot or embroider a challah cover to make our space a holy place. The Musar master, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, taught that Chazal have described each and every person as a miniature Mishkan, where the divine presence dwells. The focus of the Mishkan was the Torah, was the broken pieces of the original tablets embodied in that ark. The housing for the ark was the Mishkan, and it was built upon twin pillars of lishma, of doing things for their own sake, of the most pure of motives, and of nedivat halev, generosity of the heart, right? So the point of it was actually not the Mishkan. It was actually the tablets, the Torah, and the Mishkan was a house for it, and it was built on these twin pillars of doing things for their own sake, of having the best of motives, and of generosity. A person can make herself into a Mishkan when her essence is Torah, and when the cornerstones of her deeds are purity of motive and generosity of heart. So each of us can make ourselves into a Mishkan if those are our pillars, right? And if we think about what motivated so much of the life of CBST over these last 2 years, so many of us focused on Torah in this time, studying Psalms with each other and with Rabbi Kleinbaum, studying Mishnah with Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, taking classes with Rabbi Rapport and the interns, learning Hebrew with Mia Rothstein or Ron Weiss. We carried the sanctuary within us. We invited God to dwell within us. And even though we were deeply in the wilderness, we were deeply unsettled and unseated and not sure where to go or what to do or how we would find our way, we became the sanctuary and invited God to dwell within us. And so now, as we are able to begin re-sanctifying this space again, and in this time we're going to have to do it in stages, a little at a time, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Once a sanctuary is lived in, it's no longer a fantasy. It's no longer a dream. It's a brick and mortar place where we have to worry about social distancing and the ways the pews are wearing and water seeping in and paying the bills. But when we're here, when we fill the space with song, with prayer, with life, it's easier to remember that God dwells here, here, and here. This place is a miracle. It's the sacred work of so many hands, built with the most precious gifts of so many. So each week, I pray we will grow in health and in confidence. The sound of the song will grow stronger as we fill this space with the divine spirit that lives within each of us and which is magnified when we're together. Still connected, of course, to all of the personal, movable sanctuaries that we have created at home and on the road, but with its center reanimated here in us, growing in holiness. Shabbat Shalom.